A story of courage and self-control. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Riverside Academy as students filtered through the main entrance. Among them, walking with careful steps, was Zara Mitchell, clutching the straps of her worn backpack. The 17-year-old had learned to navigate new schools with practiced invisibility, a skill developed through years of moving from one city to another with her father. Zara's dark skin caught the morning light as she paused at the threshold, taking in the imposing brick facade and towering windows of Riverside Academy. Detroit had been their last stop, and before that, Cleveland, Philadelphia, and a handful of smaller towns she could barely remember. Each move had taught her the same lesson: keep your head down, blend in, and survive until graduation. The hallways buzzed with the familiar sounds of teenage life: locker doors slamming, sneakers squeaking against polished floors, voices rising and falling in animated conversation. Zara found her assigned locker, number 247, and quietly worked the combination her guidance counselor had provided. The metal door opened with a soft click, and she arranged her few belongings inside. "Move aside," came a voice from behind her, smooth and commanding. Zara turned to see a girl approaching with unmistakable confidence. This was clearly someone who expected the world to rearrange itself around her presence. The girl had striking features: auburn hair that cascaded in perfect waves, designer clothes that fit like they were tailored specifically for her, and eyes that surveyed everything with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to being in charge. This was Victoria Sterling, though Zara didn't know her name yet. What Zara could sense immediately was the invisible crown Victoria wore, the way other students instinctively stepped aside to let her pass. Behind Victoria walked two other girls: Riley Chen, whose sharp eyes seemed to catalogue every detail for future use, and Madison Torres, who appeared quieter but no less observant. Victoria's gaze swept over Zara with cool appraisal. The message was clear without words being spoken. Territory had been marked, and Zara was expected to understand her place in the hierarchy. Zara simply nodded slightly and closed her locker, choosing not to engage. She had learned that sometimes the safest approach was to remain invisible, at least until she understood the landscape. As Zara walked to her first class, she noticed the ripple effect of Victoria's presence. Conversations paused, postures straightened, and a general awareness seemed to follow in her wake. At the end of the hallway, leaning against a bank of lockers, stood two young men who clearly commanded their own sphere of influence. The taller one, with broad shoulders and the confident bearing of an athlete, was Marcus Sterling, Victoria's older brother and the school's basketball star. Beside him stood his friend, Alex Rivera, lean and quick, with eyes that seemed to enjoy chaos for its own sake. Zara found a seat near the window in her first period English class, hoping to observe without being observed. But she could feel Victoria's attention like a weight, calculating and measuring. Victoria sat several rows away, surrounded by her usual circle of admirers, but her gaze occasionally drifted toward the new student with something that wasn't quite curiosity and wasn't quite hostility, something more like the interest a chess player might show in studying a new opponent's opening moves. When the lunch bell rang, Zara navigated to the cafeteria with the same careful attention she brought to everything else. The large room was clearly divided into invisible territories, each table claiming its own social stratum. At the center, occupying the prime real estate where everyone could see and be seen, sat Victoria's table. It was the undisputed throne room of Riverside Academy's social kingdom. Zara chose a table in the far corner, as removed from the action as possible. She unpacked her modest lunch and tried to disappear into the background noise of hundreds of conversations. But today, invisibility wasn't going to be an option. Victoria rose from her central table with fluid grace, and Riley and Madison fell into step behind her. The cafeteria's energy shifted subtly, conversations lowering as attention focused on the drama about to unfold. Victoria approached Zara's isolated table, carrying a cup of what looked like grape juice. "Sitting all alone back here," Victoria observed, her voice carrying just loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "That must be so lonely for you." Riley smirked from behind Victoria's shoulder. Madison watched with interest, as if observing a fascinating social experiment. Around them, students began to take notice, some openly staring, others pretending to focus on their own meals while listening intently. Zara looked up from her lunch, meeting Victoria's gaze with calm brown eyes. "I don't mind the quiet," she replied simply. Victoria's smile was perfect and cold. "Oh, that's unfortunate," she said. And with what appeared to be an accidental gesture, the grape juice tipped from her cup. Purple liquid splashed across Zara's tray, soaking her sandwich and spreading across the table's surface. Gasps rippled through the nearby tables. Cell phones appeared, recording the confrontation. This was clearly a test, a public demonstration of who held power and who was expected to submit to it. Zara didn't jump up or shout. She didn't scramble to clean the mess or demand an apology. Instead, she calmly stood, picked up her ruined tray, and walked to the trash receptacle. Her movements were deliberate and controlled, as if she had rehearsed this exact scenario. She disposed of her lunch, wiped her hands with a paper napkin, and returned to the table. Only then did she look directly at Victoria again. Her expression held no anger, no fear, no embarrassment, just a steady composure that left the watching crowd uncertain how to react. "Are you finished?" Zara asked quietly. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Victoria's perfect smile faltered for just a moment, replaced by something that might have been surprise. The script she had expected, tears, anger, submission, hadn't been followed. For the first time in recent memory, Victoria Sterling found herself off balance in a social interaction. Zara gathered her backpack and walked out of the cafeteria, leaving behind a room full of students who suddenly weren't sure whose side they were supposed to be on. Victoria stood frozen for a heartbeat longer than was comfortable, then turned and walked back to her table, her confidence slightly shaken. That afternoon in physical education class, Zara found herself on the basketball court for a scrimmage game. Marcus and Alex had positioned themselves strategically, using the game as cover for a more targeted harassment. Marcus would accidentally bump into Zara during plays, each contact hard enough to throw off her balance. Alex would crowd her space, making unnecessary contact that the coach wouldn't quite catch as intentional. But Zara moved with a fluidity that surprised them. She adjusted to their interference without complaint, sidestepping Marcus's charges and slipping away from Alex's attempts to crowd her. Her movements had an economy to them, an efficiency that spoke of training beyond typical high school athletics. When the coach called the end of the scrimmage, Zara collected her belongings and headed for her locker. Taped to the metal door was a handwritten note, "Behind the old gymnasium after school. Unless you want everyone to know you're a coward." Fierce Zara read the note once, folded it carefully, and slipped it into her pocket. Around her, small groups of students pretended to be engaged in their own activities while watching her reaction. Word of the challenge had clearly spread before she'd even seen it. At her locker at the end of the day, Victoria appeared with her usual entourage. Marcus and Alex flanked the group, radiating the kind of casual menace that came from knowing they'd never faced real consequences for their actions. "I assume you got my message," Victoria said, her voice carrying the tone of someone who had never been refused. Zara closed her locker and turned to face them. This time she didn't look away or try to avoid confrontation. Her eyes met Victoria's steadily. "I'll be there," she said simply. The response fell into the hallway like a stone into still water. Victoria had expected fear, perhaps pleading, maybe an attempt to negotiate. Simple acceptance of the challenge caught her off guard, though she quickly masked her surprise with another cold smile. "Don't disappoint me," Victoria said, turning to leave with her followers in tow. As they walked away, Zara stood alone in the hallway, her fingers brushing against the cold metal of her locker door. Somewhere in her memory, her father's voice echoed, calm, firm, and absolutely certain. "You never start trouble, Zara. But if trouble finds you, you finish it on your terms with complete control." David Mitchell had been a boxer in his younger years, with promising potential that ended when an injury forced him to retire before he could pursue professional competition. Since then, he had channeled all his knowledge and discipline into training his daughter, not to make her a fighter, but to give her the tools to protect herself and maintain control no matter what situation she faced. The old gymnasium behind Riverside Academy stood like a forgotten monument to earlier decades of student athletics. By the time the final bell had rung and students had filtered out of the main building, word of the confrontation had spread through the school's social networks faster than any official announcement. Zara walked across the courtyard toward the gymnasium with measured steps. She carried only her backpack and a water bottle, but the weight on her shoulders felt immense, not from her belongings, but from the pressure of dozens of eyes watching her approach. Students had gathered in the area behind the gym, forming an irregular circle in the open space between the building and the practice fields. Victoria stood at the center of the gathering, her posture regal and confident. Riley and Madison flanked her, while Marcus and Alex completed the circle of intimidation. The crowd around them buzzed with nervous energy, cell phones held high to capture whatever was about to unfold. As Zara stepped into the circle, the chatter died down to whispers. The air felt charged with anticipation, everyone waiting for the spark that would ignite the confrontation they'd all come to witness. Victoria's voice carried clearly across the space. "I thought you might run away like a frightened little rabbit." Scattered laughter rose from some of the onlookers. Zara didn't react to the taunt, simply looked directly at Victoria with the same steady gaze she'd maintained all day. "I said I would come," Zara replied, her voice calm and clear. "I keep my promises." The confidence in her response caused a ripple of uncertainty through the crowd. Victoria's smile tightened slightly, but she pressed forward, turning to address the gathered students. "Did you all hear that? She thinks she can stand up to me." Victoria gestured dismissively. "Let's see how tough the new girl really is." With a subtle nod from Victoria, Marcus stepped forward. His height and athletic build made him an imposing figure, and he'd clearly been chosen to make the first move. His approach was casual, almost lazy, the confidence of someone who had never encountered real resistance. "This won't take long," Marcus said, reaching out to shove Zara backward. But Zara moved like water, flowing around his extended arm and using his forward momentum against him. In a movement too quick for most of the crowd to follow, she had redirected his energy and sent him stumbling off balance. Marcus hit the ground hard, his expression shifting from cocky confidence to shocked disbelief. The crowd drew a collective breath. Marcus, the school's basketball star, had been put on the ground by the quiet new girl in a matter of seconds. Before Marcus could fully process what had happened, Alex charged forward with a shout of anger and embarrassment for his friend. His approach was more aggressive, driven by emotion rather than strategy. Zara sidestepped smoothly, caught his extended arm, and twisted it behind his back in a controlled lock. Alex cried out in pain and surprise, forced to his knees by the precise application of leverage and pressure. Zara held the position just long enough to demonstrate her control, then released him. Alex crumpled forward, clutching his shoulder and staring at her with a mixture of pain and bewilderment. The gathered students stood in stunned silence. Phones trembled in hands that had expected to record a very different scene. Whispers began to spread through the crowd. She took down Marcus. Did you see how fast she moved? Alex didn't even see it coming. Victoria's face had gone pale, her carefully constructed confidence cracking as she watched her main enforcers neutralized with what appeared to be minimal effort. But pride and desperation drove her forward rather than allowing her to retreat. With a scream of frustrated rage, Victoria lunged at Zara from behind, hoping to catch her off guard and salvage some semblance of dominance from the situation. But Zara's training had taught her to remain constantly aware of her surroundings. She spun at the last moment, caught Victoria's wrist, and controlled her momentum. For a heartbeat, Zara could have allowed Victoria to fall face first into the dirt, humiliating her completely in front of the entire school. Instead, she held Victoria steady, demonstrating control rather than cruelty. Leaning close enough that only Victoria could hear, Zara spoke quietly but firmly. "You were never as strong as you pretended, and you will never control me." Victoria's eyes went wide, the words hitting her like a physical blow. The truth she had hidden even from herself, that her power had always been built on others' willingness to submit, rather than on any real strength of her own, was suddenly undeniable. Zara released her grip, and Victoria staggered backward, nearly losing her balance. The circle of students watched in silence as their former queen struggled to maintain her composure. Riley and Madison, who had always followed Victoria's lead, now stood uncertain and separated from her. Marcus slowly picked himself up from the ground, his head lowered in defeat. Alex remained on his knees, still nursing his injured shoulder. Standing alone in the center of the circle, Zara took a deep breath and looked around at the faces surrounding her. She saw no satisfaction in what had happened, only a necessary conclusion to a confrontation she hadn't wanted but couldn't avoid. The whispers began again, but they were different now. Victoria lost. Zara didn't even break a sweat. "I've never seen anything like that." Victoria's carefully constructed social empire had crumbled in a matter of minutes. She turned and walked away quickly, almost running, leaving behind a crowd that no longer knew quite what to think about the social order they'd taken for granted. Zara waited for the circle to disperse somewhat, then gathered her backpack and walked toward the main road. Students parted to let her pass, their expressions a mixture of awe and uncertainty. She had proven her point without seriously injuring anyone, just as her father had taught her. Control, not destruction. That evening, Zara sat at the small kitchen table in the modest apartment she shared with her father. David Mitchell looked up from the newspaper he'd been reading, studying his daughter's face with the practiced eye of someone who knew her better than anyone else in the world. "Rough day at school?" he asked gently. Zara told him everything: the cafeteria incident, the challenge, the confrontation behind the gymnasium. When she finished, David set down his paper and regarded her with a mixture of pride and concern. "You handled it exactly right," he said finally. "You didn't start the conflict, but you finished it on your terms. Nobody went to the hospital, nobody was seriously hurt, and most importantly, you didn't lose control." Zara nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "I keep thinking about Detroit, Dad. About what happened with Angela." David's expression grew serious. 2 years earlier, at Zara's previous school, a girl named Angela Hayes had targeted Zara with relentless bullying and harassment. The situation had escalated over weeks until Zara finally snapped, using her training in a moment of pure anger. Angela had ended up hospitalized with serious injuries, and the incident had forced them to leave Detroit and start over in a new city. "That was different," David said firmly. "In Detroit, you lost control. You let anger guide your actions instead of discipline. Today, you showed perfect restraint. You used exactly as much force as necessary and not a bit more." "But what if it happens again?" Zara asked, voicing the fear that had haunted her for 2 years. What if I can't control myself the next time? David reached across the table and took her hand. Zara, the fact that you're worried about losing control means you won't. The discipline I've taught you isn't just about technique. It's about knowing when to stop. Today proved you've learned that lesson. The next morning brought a completely transformed atmosphere to Riverside Academy. As Zara walked through the hallways, she noticed the change immediately. Students who had previously ignored her now offered respectful nods. A few younger students looked at her with something approaching admiration. The whispers that followed her were no longer mocking, but curious and respectful. Victoria, meanwhile, moved through the same hallways like a ghost of her former self. The confident stride was gone, replaced by hesitant steps. Her usual entourage had evaporated. Riley and Madison now walked their own paths, no longer content to orbit around Victoria's fading star. Marcus avoided eye contact with everyone, his pride still wounded from his public defeat. Alex had chosen not to come to school at all, too embarrassed to face the questions and stares. In first period, Zara chose her usual seat by the window, but the atmosphere around her was entirely different. Where before she had been an object of curiosity or disdain, now she was treated with a careful respect. Teachers, who had barely noticed her existence, now made eye contact when they spoke to the class. Fellow students included her in their group discussions instead of talking around her. At lunch, the shift in the school's social dynamics became even more apparent. Victoria sat alone at what had once been the most coveted table in the cafeteria. The central location that had once announced her status now highlighted her isolation. Students passed by without stopping. Conversations continued without including her, and the invisible circle of influence that had once surrounded her had completely disappeared. Zara observed this from her corner table, feeling a complicated mix of emotions. She remembered all too clearly what it felt like to be on the receiving end of a school's collective rejection, and despite everything Victoria had done, she found herself feeling sympathy for the girl's situation. After finishing her lunch, Zara made a decision that surprised everyone in the cafeteria, including herself. She picked up her tray and walked across the room to Victoria's empty table. Conversations stopped, heads turned, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Victoria looked up in shock as Zara set her tray down and took a seat across from her. For a moment, neither girl spoke. Then Zara's voice carried clearly enough for nearby tables to hear. "This doesn't have to continue," she said simply. "I don't want to keep fighting, and I hope you don't either." Victoria's eyes filled with tears. She was trying desperately not to shed. The words weren't delivered with triumph or gloating, but with something that might have been understanding. For the first time in years, someone was offering Victoria a way out of a conflict instead of demanding her surrender. Zara didn't wait for a response. She stood, gathered her tray, and returned to her corner table, leaving Victoria to process the unexpected gesture of, what? Mercy? Respect? Whatever it was, the entire cafeteria had witnessed it, and the whispers that followed were entirely different from the ones that had surrounded the confrontation behind the gymnasium. In the days that followed, Riverside Academy underwent a subtle but profound transformation. The culture of intimidation that had once permeated the hallways began to dissolve. Students who had previously kept their heads down began to participate more actively in class discussions. Younger students no longer cowered when passing groups of upperclassmen in the corridors. A thin, nervous boy named Jonathan, who had been one of Victoria's frequent targets, surprised everyone by trying out for the debate team. A quiet girl named Sarah, who had always eaten lunch alone to avoid unwanted attention, began joining study groups and participating in after-school activities. Zara watched these changes with quiet satisfaction. She had never intended to become a catalyst for social change. She had simply refused to accept the role of victim that had been assigned to her. But her example had shown other students that it was possible to stand up for themselves with dignity and strength. Victoria, meanwhile, struggled to find her place in this new social order. The fear-based respect she had once commanded was gone, but she was slowly learning what it meant to earn genuine regard through different means. It was a painful process, but occasionally Zara would catch her helping a younger student with homework or participating in group projects with quiet competence rather than domineering control. One afternoon, as Zara was organizing her locker, Victoria approached her alone, without her former entourage, without the dramatic gestures that had once announced her presence. She simply walked up and stood nearby until Zara acknowledged her. "I wanted to thank you," Victoria said quietly, her voice barely audible above the hallway noise. Zara turned, surprised by the genuine humility in Victoria's tone. "For what?" Zara asked. "For not destroying me when you could have," Victoria replied. "Behind the gym, in the cafeteria afterward, you could have humiliated me completely. Instead, you gave me a chance to walk away with some dignity intact." Zara considered this for a moment, then nodded slightly. "Everyone deserves a chance to be better than their worst moment." Victoria's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I don't know if I can be better. I don't know who I am without all of that." She gestured vaguely, encompassing the power structure she had once controlled. "Maybe that's the point," Zara suggested gently. "Maybe you get to figure out who you really are instead of who you thought you had to be." The conversation was brief, but it marked another shift in the slowly evolving relationship between the two girls. They would never be close friends. Too much had happened for that, but they had found a way to coexist with mutual respect rather than antagonism. As the weeks passed, David Mitchell watched his daughter with growing pride. The confident, controlled young woman he saw leaving for school each morning was a far cry from the angry, frightened girl who had caused so much trouble in Detroit. Zara had learned the most important lesson he could teach her. True strength wasn't about dominating others, but about maintaining control over yourself, regardless of the circumstances. "You know," he said one evening as they shared dinner, "I think we might be able to stay in this city for a while." Zara looked up, surprised. They had moved so often that the possibility of permanence had seemed almost impossible to imagine. "Really?" she asked. David nodded. "You've found your balance here. You're not running from your past anymore. You're building something better. That tells me you're ready to put down roots." For the first time since leaving Detroit, Zara allowed herself to imagine a future that extended beyond just surviving until graduation. She thought about college applications, about friendships that could develop over years instead of months, about becoming part of a community instead of just passing through it. At Riverside Academy, the changes that had begun with one girl's refusal to accept bullying had rippled outward in ways that surprised everyone. Teachers noticed that classroom discussions were more dynamic, with students who had previously remained silent now contributing thoughtfully to debates and group projects. The principal received fewer reports of conflicts in the hallways and cafeteria. Even the janitorial staff noticed a decrease in vandalism and petty destruction. The story of what had happened behind the old gymnasium became part of the school's unofficial lore, but it was remembered not as a tale of victory and defeat, but as a demonstration of the power of self-control and principled resistance to intimidation. Zara had shown that it was possible to stand up to bullying without becoming a bully yourself, to defend your dignity without destroying your opponents. Victoria, for her part, gradually began to rebuild her reputation on a foundation of genuine contribution rather than fear-based dominance. She joined the student council and used her organizational skills to coordinate charity drives and community service projects. The leadership qualities that had once been corrupted by a desire for power were slowly being redirected toward more positive purposes. Marcus found his way back to being simply a good basketball player instead of someone who used his athletic status to intimidate others. Alex discovered that he was actually quite funny when he wasn't trying to impress people through cruelty, and he began writing for the school newspaper with a wit that was sharp but not mean-spirited. Riley and Madison, freed from their roles as Victoria's lieutenants, revealed personalities and interests that had been previously overshadowed by their association with the school's former queen. Riley turned out to be a talented artist, while Madison showed a gift for mathematics that earned her recognition in academic competitions. The transformation wasn't immediate or complete. Changing a school's culture is a gradual process, and there were still moments of tension and conflict. But the fundamental dynamic had shifted. Students who had once accepted intimidation as inevitable began to believe that they could resist it successfully. Teachers who had grown cynical about teenage behavior started to see glimpses of the kindness and courage that teenagers were capable of when they felt safe enough to express it. Zara herself remained somewhat apart from the social hierarchies that continued to evolve around her. She participated in classes and activities, made casual friendships, and treated everyone with the same quiet respect she expected in return. She had not sought to become a leader or a symbol, but her example had given others permission to stand up for themselves and for each other. One spring afternoon, as Zara sat in the courtyard reading during lunch break, a younger student approached her nervously. The girl was small and slight, with the hunched shoulders and downcast eyes of someone who had learned to make herself as invisible as possible. "Excuse me," the girl said quietly. "Are you Zara Mitchell?" Zara looked up from her book and nodded. "I'm Emma," the girl continued, then hesitated before rushing ahead with her words. "I wanted to thank you. What you did last fall, it changed things for people like me. I know you probably don't even know who I am, but the bullying stopped after that, not just for me, but for a lot of us." Zara closed her book and gave Emma her full attention. "I'm glad things got better for you." Emma nodded earnestly. "It's not just that the bullying stopped. It's that I learned I don't have to accept it. When someone tries to push me around now, I remember what you did. I remember that I can stand up for myself without being mean about it." After Emma left, Zara sat in the courtyard thinking about the unexpected consequences of that confrontation behind the gymnasium. She had acted purely in self-defense, with no intention of changing anything beyond her own situation. But her refusal to accept the role of victim had apparently given others permission to do the same. As graduation approached, Zara began to understand that her time at Riverside Academy had been about more than just surviving another school transfer. For the first time, she had learned what it meant to be part of a community, to leave a place better than she had found it, not through grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but simply by refusing to compromise her own principles. The lessons her father had taught her about self-control and principled strength had proven to be about more than just physical self-defense. They were about maintaining your integrity regardless of the circumstances, about choosing to respond rather than react, about understanding that true power comes from within rather than from the ability to dominate others. At the graduation ceremony, as Zara walked across the stage to receive her diploma, she spotted her father in the audience. David Mitchell's smile was filled with a pride that went far beyond academic achievement. He was seeing the fruition of years of careful guidance, the evidence that his daughter had learned not just to protect herself physically, but to navigate the complex social and moral challenges of adolescence with wisdom and grace. Victoria was also among the graduates, walking across the same stage, just a few names before Zara in the alphabetical listing. Their eyes met briefly as Victoria returned to her seat. and they exchanged the smallest of nods, an acknowledgement of the journey they had both taken from that first confrontation to this moment of shared accomplishment. As the ceremony concluded and families gathered for pictures and celebrations, Zara found herself surrounded by classmates who wanted to congratulate her and say goodbye. She was struck by how many of them mentioned in one way or another how her presence at Riverside Academy had made a difference in their high school experience. Jonathan, the shy boy who had found the courage to join the debate team, shook her hand and told her that he had earned a scholarship to college, based partly on his success in speech and debate competitions. Sarah, who had discovered her voice in study groups and activities, was heading to a prestigious university to study psychology with the goal of becoming a counselor for young people. Even some of the students who had initially been aligned with Victoria's social circle approached Zara to express their gratitude for the way she had handled the conflicts of that first semester. They had learned from her example that it was possible to be strong without being cruel, to stand up for yourself without tearing others down. As the afternoon wore on and the crowd began to thin, Zara found herself standing alone near the football field, where so much of the school's social drama had played out over the past 4 years. David approached and stood beside her, both of them looking out over the empty field. "Any regrets?" he asked. Zara considered the question carefully. The confrontation behind the gymnasium had set in motion a chain of events that had transformed not just her own high school experience, but the experiences of many of her classmates. But it had also been a moment of violence, however controlled and justified it might have been. "No," she said finally. "I wish it hadn't been necessary, but I don't regret standing up for myself. And I don't regret the way I chose to do it." David nodded, understanding the distinction. "You learned the most important lesson of all, that how you win matters as much as whether you win, maybe more." As they walked back toward their car, Zara thought about the future that lay ahead of her. She had been accepted to several good colleges, with plans to study social work and eventually work with at-risk youth. The experiences of her high school years, both the challenges and the triumphs, had given her insight into the ways that young people could either lift each other up or tear each other down. She wanted to spend her career helping teenagers like Emma find their voices, like Victoria learn to channel their leadership qualities in positive directions, like Marcus and Alex discover their worth beyond their ability to intimidate others. The lessons she had learned from her father about self-control and principled strength would serve her not just in protecting herself, but in teaching others to protect themselves as well. The story of Zara Mitchell's time at Riverside Academy would be remembered long after she had graduated and moved on to college, but it would be remembered not as a tale of conflict and dominance, but as an example of how one person's commitment to doing what was right, even when it was difficult, could create positive change that extended far beyond their own immediate circumstances. In the years that followed, teachers at Riverside Academy would sometimes reference the Mitchell example when talking to students about conflict resolution and personal integrity. The phrase came to mean standing up for yourself and others without compromising your own values, defending your dignity without destroying your opponents, and understanding that true strength comes from self-control rather than the ability to control others. And in a small apartment across town, David Mitchell would sometimes pull out newspaper clippings about his daughter's academic achievements and community service work during her college years, knowing that the foundation for all of those accomplishments had been laid during those crucial months when she learned that being strong meant being responsible for how you use that strength. The lessons of that time would stay with Zara for the rest of her life. that real power comes from within, that how you handle conflict defines who you are as a person, and that sometimes the most important battles are won not by destroying your enemies, but by showing them that there is a better way to live.